Sean will be around to monitor that, I'm sure, won't you, Sean, in case anything crops up that we need to review or return to?
Yeah, definitely. No problem at all.
Great. Are we recording? Are we good to go?
Yes, we are. Good to go.
Right, thanks, folks. I think we can skip this bit. You've probably heard me speak before. And in fact, if you have been to previous sessions in this kind of series, I've tried today to make sure that the resources that I share haven't been covered in the past. Now, there may be one or two exceptions. You might spot something and think, I've seen Martin demonstrate this tool, this trick or tactic before. But on the whole, we've gone for material that we've been writing over the last year or so. And in fact, we've got two activities that we've only just developed very recently as well, all of which are focused on revision and should be really useful. I hope they are anyway. Quick reminder, there's a handout that goes with tonight's session. Sean's already got a copy of that and she's going to be making that available. And also tonight's PowerPoint is yours as well for use with students, staff or parents. All of this is really useful, I think, and hopefully will give you plenty to be thinking about. Now, I don't need to labour the point about the VESPA model at all. In fact, I think a simpler way of looking at it tonight might be with a focus entirely on revision. How do we get your 11s, 12s or 13s preparing effectively for tests and exams? And you might already be using the VESPA model, or you use it as a lens through which to kind of assess student performance. So I'm going to suggest a simplification for the purposes of this afternoon, okay? That we focus ourselves entirely on revision by taking the whole kind of vision and effort element of the model, knowing what you want to achieve and working hard towards it, and kind of just saying, right, motivation. We've got to get students motivated effectively so they revise. We take the systems element of the model and we just say, let's call this organization of materials. And we take the practice and attitude element of the model and we say, let's just call this revision. And I've been working with a number of schools recently who aren't familiar with the VESPA model, but are quite happy to just take motivation, organization, revision as a very simple mantra for their year 11s in the kind of few months we've got left in the run up to the summer exams. So if you wanted to simplify your message or start with a much clearer, more defined sense of what you're trying to achieve, it might be a simple and useful way of conceiving of the whole process of teaching students to revise more effectively. I have brought along for a 90-minute session 8 activities tonight. So let's have this afternoon rather. So let's have a look. I'm going to share 2 motivation activities with you. So what I've found working with year 11 this year and last year is that some schools will tell me they're just not even starting. We can't get them to sit down and actually do anything. So if that's you, or you've got a cohort of students like this, I've got 2 activities for you, one called Now versus Most, one called Activating and Sustaining, which surface this idea of how do we motivate ourselves to begin work. So that might be a component of what you're facing in your context. When it comes to organisation, I've brought along 2 activities. One, the bottom left, is the one you're most likely to be familiar with. Environment design, less so. And both of those have worked particularly well with cohorts of students that I've worked with at Key Stage 4 and 5. And that leaves 50% of the activities, the other 4, focused entirely on how do we teach students to revise in the most effective ways, okay? And we've got some materials there for you to be jumping into. Some of them are very simple and we'll deal with them very quickly, okay? Some of these activities we can get done in a matter of minutes. Others I'd like to spend a little bit longer on. So once we get to the second half of today's presentation, the revision stuff, I think we'll take our time on that so that we can really get to grips with how we might deliver this to students, staff, or of course, parents. Okay, because I do a lot of this parent work around about January and February. One final thing before we jump in. Although I want to be as practical as possible today, I think to really get to grips with the challenge we face teaching students how to revise effectively, we need to anchor our thinking in some theory. Okay, so there is going to be a very short section on motivation, where we're going to look at the work of 3 academics who focus specifically on how to motivate learners and what motivation is and how it occurs. So that's the first thing. And then we're going to look at 3 more academic research pieces of work around revision as well. So a little more theory than we might usually have, but I think it's really important if we're going to persuade staff, parents, and of course students to revise in the right way, that we can say more than just studies show that if you do this, you'll be more successful, that we can give students a bit more to ground their thinking in than that oft repeated phrase, studies show. We can be a bit more specific. Okay, without further ado, then let's dive in. Hopefully there's some stuff here that's useful for you. Every one of these eight activities is accompanied by a page or 2 pages of handout, which Sian has ready for you and that you can use in your own time and situation. Right, let's jump in and have a look at a couple of motivation activities. Before we do, 3 theorists worth your time. So worth thinking about this. If you're responsible for a cohort or a year group and you need to get them motivated in the run up to mock exams or the real exams, 3 people whose work might be of use to you. 1, let's begin with the preposterously named Victor Vroom and remind ourselves of his expectancy value theory. I think this is a really important one for motivating students in a school or college context. Here's what Vroom says, a Yale scholar, about motivation. He says, successful students are motivated because there is an expectancy of future happiness. That's where the word expectancy comes from. It's the value of this future expectancy. And he's saying an issue we have motivating students is if they don't feel this strong sense that future happiness will be a product of exam success. So he examines this in a really interesting way, and I'd like you to consider this from your own organizational point of view. 3 components, he says. Number 1, the student has to feel confidence that effort improves performance. Okay, so I think this is worth reflecting on a moment. Do your students see a connection between increased effort and increased performance, or inadvertently, does the organization promote the idea that ability improves performance or talent improves performance? One way in which we accidentally undermine motivation is by promoting stories of talented or able students doing well rather than high effort students doing well. So that's the first thing. It might be worth auditing your context and culture and thinking, are we sending out the right messages in 2023 about effort improves performance? Secondly, what Vroom calls instrumentality. Increased performance leads to increased grades. Exam outcomes are not random. Now, that might be another one to think about, because you might think, well, that's fair enough. We're very clear on that one. But I've worked with organizations who are not clear on this one. There are stories abounding that rogue examiners, we had a rogue examiner last year, or this question last year, all the kids failed. It was marked really poorly, or they couldn't find any examiners last year, so they used a load of graduates and it was all a disaster. If students hear this kind of narrative, it's very hard to motivate them because they don't think the exam is going to treat them fairly. So increased effort improves performance. Increased performance improves grades. We need to be really clear on that with students. And finally, increased grades bring you value. All right, we've got to be really clear on that as well. What value comes with increased grades? Increased choice, increased freedom, whatever it happens to be. So I think that's an interesting place to start. It's a good place to think about your own culture, audit your own organization, and make sure that you're clear on that one. Second piece of research, which I've found particularly useful when I'm thinking about motivating students, and this is Decky and Ryan's work on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, University of Rochester. If you guys are anything like me, I pretty much knew nothing about this other than Here it was that it was a kind of binary thing. And extrinsic motivation was when you were motivated by rewards or punishments which were externally imposed. And intrinsic motivation was when you were kind of motivated by internally important interests, values, or ambitions. That's about as much as I knew until I really dug into their work. And actually, it's a really nuanced and interesting piece of research, which argues that motivation is not binary, either extrinsic or intrinsic, but instead there are 5 parts to it, moving gradually from the external on the left-hand side, where we might be persuading year 11s to revise through external rewards or punishments, towards what I think is really crucial for year 11, 12, and 13 students, effortful self-control, all right, where they're beginning to reward themselves or punish themselves. And that takes a little while. We have to teach them how to do that. Towards a kind of somewhat internal motivation where they're beginning to develop a value system of their own. You know, revision is important to me because exam outcomes are important to me. And I'll tell you why they're important to me. Once we get students to that point, we can rely less on reward and punishment. Towards finally, a kind of synthesis of an internal value system where they're thinking, this is important to me. And what comes with that is a kind of a developing enjoyment. So we can't expect all students to simply shift like a switch from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation. We have to move them gradually through these stages. And I think a lot of the VESPA activities, inadvertently, because I didn't know this research, help students do that bit by bit. So interesting stuff there. I like sharing this with parents, and I wonder whether you will find this useful too. I've stolen the work from Daniel Pink's book, Drive, which is a study of motivation. And I've looked specifically at the idea of money. This came up because I spoke again and again to parents who were saying, we've got this reward system for him where he gets £10 per good grade or whatever it happens to be. So if you would like to explore this with parents or students, the following slides might be of use. Before we get there, let's have a little listen to this short clip where Pink introduces the idea of externally imposed rewards. All right, if you work harder, you'll get this money, and the surprising outcomes that he discovers when he looks closely at that. Let's have a quick listen.
Our motivations are unbelievably interesting. I mean, I've been working on this for a few years, and I just find the topic still so amazingly engaging and interesting. So I want to tell you about that. Let's go from London to the mean streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the northeastern part of the United States. And let's talk about a study done at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Here's what they did. They took a whole group of students, and they gave them a set of challenges. Things like memorizing strings of digits, solving word puzzles, other kinds of spatial puzzles, even physical tasks like throwing a ball through a hoop. Okay, they gave them these challenges, and they said to incentivize their performance, they gave them 3 levels of rewards. Okay, so if you did pretty well, you got a small monetary reward. If you did medium well, you got a medium monetary reward. And if you did really well, if you were one of the top performers, you got a large cash prize. Okay. We've seen this movie before. This is essentially a typical motivation scheme within organizations, right? We reward the very top performers, we ignore the low performers, and the other folks kind of in the middle. Okay, you get a little bit. So what happens?
Okay, so I like stopping the video at that point. The video stops at that point because that is a terrific discussion to have with students. What do you think happens? We've got all of these tasks. We've got these monetary rewards. And you can get a good discussion going about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation from that clip alone. But if you'd like to dive into it even further, here's what I do. You might want to steal the same idea. I say, before you predict what happens in this study, I'm going to show you 5 other studies which involve money as motivation. And I'd like you to guess whether the money works in these circumstances. Here we go. In 2012, primary school pupils are offered $20 for their little SAT scores in reading, writing, maths and science. $20 is a lot of money when you're in primary school. Any difference there or not? Have a think about that one. And then in 2013, 11,000 students in New York are offered $300 for passing or $600 for passing with proficiency on standardized exams. Any effect? Here's a Canadian study. Graduates get, or undergrads get $100 if their grade is higher than 70%, with an additional $20 for every 1% they're higher than 70. Does that have any impact? What about back in Europe, 2010, Dutch students are offered $600 to complete their all the first year requirements of their undergraduate studies. And then finally, study number 5, students are offered some optional support classes, okay? Group 1 get a certificate for attending. Group 2 get $25 if they attend quite a few of them. What are the impact? And the kids will dive in and tell you which ones are going to make an impact and which ones aren't. And they've got good examples of why that might be. And they often equate the higher the prize, the more likely it will be to motivate. And then you do the big reveal, folks. What happens in study 1? There's no difference. The money makes no difference. Study 2, the money makes no difference. Study 3, no difference. Study 4, no difference. Study 5, oh, hang on. There is some difference with study 5. The group offered the certificate attended more classes. The group offered money, no difference. Money doesn't seem to work, this external kind of motivational tactic. Instead, the certificate works because students are developing a sense of what's important to them. And I think there's an interesting lesson to be learned there, that we have to develop a value system, each of us, in which success in exams is important. We can help students do that. So let's return to the Daniel Pink example, because I've split the little clip into 2. So we're going to hear the second half of it now. Let's see what he found in his study.
So what happens? They do the test, they have these incentives. Here's what they found out. 1, as long as the task involved only mechanical skill, bonuses worked as they would be expected. The higher the pay, the better their performance. Okay, that makes sense. But here's what happens. But once the task called for even rudimentary cognitive skill, a larger reward led to poorer performance. Now, this is strange, right? A larger reward led to poorer performance? How can that possibly be?
So it's a fascinating one to talk about with students because externally imposed rewards and punishments aren't enough. Once you reach this level, you need to know why exams and outcomes are important to you, and we can help you develop a value system which supports that. So there's an interesting one. And finally, on motivation, the work of Thaler and Sunstein, who look at the idea that students are motivated by the behavior of their peers, because people want to feel, quote unquote, normal. I belong here. I'm similar to everybody else. And rather than look directly at their work, I've got a little audio file here of teacher and writer Mark Enzer talking about the importance of making the behavior we want appear to be normal, okay? That we don't tell students off for not revising. None of you are working hard enough, because all we do is normalize that disengagement. Let's have a listen to him. He explains it well, I think.
Which is trying to make the thing that you want them to do normal. To really emphasize that, well, everyone else is doing it. Rather than you're all being terrible, none of you are revising, none of you are studying, because that just normalizes not doing those things. Rather than, I was really impressed, I checked and almost everyone had done their revision homework, did really well and cleaned up a lot of effort, and then quietly saying to one pupil, I noticed you didn't, is everything okay? Because everyone else did it, did you not for a reason? And just making it normal to do those things. And I think that's where we sometimes run into those difficulties, is we kind of normalize not doing the thing that we want them to do. We're saying it's weird to study to the point where I'm going to have to bribe you to do it.
Okay, so that's what we need to avoid here. Study is weird. We have to bribe you to do it. Instead, we're going to create, and you can start right now over the next few months, a kind of a sense of people work hard here. They work hard in year 11, in 12 or in 13 in the run up to the exams. We teach you how to revise effectively. The results are going to be really good. And then we pick off students who aren't engaging to make them feel like they're not part of the norm, as opposed to creating a norm that is the disengagement. So some interesting theory there. I hope that's useful. Let's dive straight into the activities. I've got a couple on motivation. I want to tell you a little bit about now versus most. This came because I was trying to motivate a group of disengaged students. And they felt that there was no point in revising because it meant giving up everything. All right. Everything I find interesting about the world, everything that I like, everything I enjoy has to go out the window for this hugely dedicated 6-month period where I have no fun whatsoever. And I just study all the time. And I realized that's why these characters aren't engaging with their revision. They see it as sacrificing everything they enjoy. And so having worked with them, I've developed this activity which worked really well. It was based on, this famous quote, disciplines based on choosing between, choosing between what you want now and what you want most. So we worked with a group of students to introduce this idea of now versus most, and we gave them an example. You might want to try this, where the students start by recording. Let's forget what the noise that you hear in your head, what the temptations that you've got around you right now. Let's focus on what you want most. All right. What would a terrific outcome look like? What doors would it open? Where might you be going next? How exciting might it be? And we gave them some examples of what other students had said. Sometimes the students express it in grades. Sometimes they say, I just want to know the material so well I can help my mates. Other times they've got a university or a course in mind. Sometimes it's to do with parents, or sometimes it's like, I'm doing no work all summer because I've finished. And so on. You've got this wonderful, clear vision of what they want most. But then they start listing, so what happens when you sit down to try and revise? What's the crowded kind of noise in your head about what you want now? And they often list things like this. I just want to sunbathe. I just want to take the afternoon off. I just want to play FIFA, check social, lie on the sofa, stare into space, binge watch this box set, which I just want to go shopping. I want to be with my girlfriend, whatever it happens to be. And then what we do is we ask them not to give up all these things on the left-hand side, because that's their misconception, that successful students have none of these problems. Why do I? Instead, we ask them to analyze which ones are creating the most difficulty for them. Here's how you do that. You say you're going to give every single one of these problems you've got at the moment a regularity score. 1, 2, or 3. 0, 1, 2, or 3. 0 if you almost never do it. 1 sometimes, 2 often, and 3 always. So they give each one a score, 0, 1, 2, or 3, depending upon how regularly it's a problem. And then you give it a score for damage. When it happens, how much damage does it do to your ability to revise? 0, 1, 2, or 3. So they might end up with something. There's their regularity, there's their damage. I like asking them to times the two together, and therefore there would be a maximum score of 9. Okay. And similarly, if anything had a score of 0, the outcome would be 0, which I think is important. And then you just ask them, why don't we pick off 1 or 2 activities that are having the most effect? We've got 3 6s and a 9 to look at here. Everything else you can carry on doing. Let's start with checking social regularly, and let's design a revision session where that doesn't happen. Or let's start with ditching work and taking the afternoon off. And let's design an afternoon revision session which is really engaging and interesting and straightforward, so that you don't struggle with that particular issue. And what we're trying to show students here is you don't have to revolutionize your life. You don't have to have this monastic, cloistered existence in which nothing happens but work. You can audit your behavior at the moment and pick off 2 or 3 issues and let yourself do the others. So that's been an interesting activity for us. Maybe you want to give that one a go. And here's another one on revision that you might find, on motivation rather, that you might find useful. It's called activating and sustaining. And it came from, can you believe it? It came from me looking up the word motivation in the dictionary in a desperate attempt to try and persuade students to be more motivated, and realizing that a lot of definitions focus on the two components to motivation. And I genuinely never thought this before. Motivation is the ability to initiate action, to move from doing nothing to doing something, but then to sustain that action over a long period. And I thought, gosh, yeah, I've not been clear with students about that. So these are the slides I share with the kids. That part of motivating yourself is just getting started, moving from doing nothing to doing something. But another part of motivating yourself is continuing once you've started, being able to do it for a week or 2 weeks or a month. And interviewing poorly motivated students, I found quite quickly that they had very few motivational techniques, and that the techniques they had were usually only initiate techniques. I'll give you an example. One lad said to me, "I just scare myself by imagining how horrible my life will be if I fail everything, sir." And that usually gets me going. And I said, how long does it get you going for? Well, not very long. And how often do you have to keep doing it? Well, I've been trying to do it a lot, and it's kind of fading. I'm not as scared now as I used to be. It's an initiate tactic that doesn't sustain action over a long period of time. So again, 2 columns, very simple. And you say, I'm going to share 20 motivational techniques that students have used before. You might want to adjust my list by interviewing your own students. And I ask students to throw away the ones that don't look like they're going to work. Motivation is a very personal thing, you can say. Chuck out the 10 or 12 that don't look like they're going to work for you. Keep 8 or 10 of really good ones. And then put them in either initiate if you think they're going to fire you up when you're feeling sluggish, or sustain if they're going to be techniques that keep you going once you're up and running. And then you introduce all 20, sometimes bit by bit like this. And other times you can bring them all up at once and say, here we go, let's have a look through all of these. When I last did this with a group of students just before Christmas, there were lots of staff in the room. It was a big auditorium, and all the staff were asked as well, pick out a number that you've used in the past and tell the story of how it was important to you. So we modeled it first with teachers saying, I like number 16, or I like number 7. And then we had students discussing in groups which ones they liked using. It really surfaced for them a sense of the breadth of possibility when it comes to activating and sustaining behavior. They threw out the ones they didn't like, they kept the ones they did. And then I finished the session with this. What have I missed? Share your motivational techniques with each other. And they had to write them down on a piece of paper and put them all up at the front, and I read them out anonymously. So we had an even longer list of possible motivational techniques. So there's only 2 there, plenty more where they came from, but there might be good activities to get students thinking and talking about the nature of motivation. Let's move on, folks. You can see I brought along some wonderful gifts today for you. What time are we on? Yeah, we're doing pretty well. 2 o'clock. Organisation, just 2 activities for you here, and these are going to be the quickest of the afternoon session. We should probably cover both of these in probably 10 to 15 minutes so we can really dive into the revision section of this afternoon's stuff. So yeah, two activities, the bottom left and environment design. Now, the bottom left is a very simple activity that I developed in response to a student saying, I would like to revise, but I don't know where to start. This was a GCSE lad who was all over the place. I've just got so much to do, so I just don't even know where to start. Now, if you're dealing with any students like that, this is a great little simple activity. With apologies if you've seen it before, this is the one you're most likely to be familiar with. You can ask them to take all of their GCSEs and make a kind of objective, thoughtful judgment about them. First judgment on the horizontal. How well am I understanding the content of this GCSE? And second judgment on the vertical. How much am I enjoying this GCSE? And, you know, if you've got 20 minutes with a group of students, they can all be making these carefully considered assessments. And sometimes courses end up here. Right? Yeah, this is my English Lit, sir, or that's my psychology, I'm well on top of it. And sometimes they begin to creep down towards the bottom here. And you can see how this activity is going to work. It's very simple. You start looking at the bottom left. What have we got in this quadrant of not understanding and not enjoying? These are the topics, activities, or courses that are going to cause us problems. How do we begin to revise them? It feels like we haven't got enough time. It's overwhelming. What I tell students to do is have a look at what's in the top right, okay, and transfer the focus and attention and time off those courses for a short period of time, a week, and transfer them immediately to subjects in the bottom left, okay, and pick out 2 or 3 quick actions or activities that you could undertake to improve your performance. And this has been very simple at GCSE level, so that students stop cutting loose an entire course that they know they're not going to do well on. And instead, right now in these early stages, we begin to tackle things that are going to keep them awake at night in April or May. So it's a good little activity to do. You want to try it at Key Stage 5, you can do it with an entire course and break it down into its topics, its subcomponents. So have a go. You know, you might be teaching A-level economics or law, and you can say, here are the 20 topics you need to know. Put them all somewhere on this grid, and it'll tell you immediately where your attention needs to be to start with. So that's a good little activity to have a go at. How about this one? Environment design, the idea that the spaces in which we work have a significant impact on our levels of focus and concentration. Okay, so if that's you and you're thinking, gosh, yeah, I think a lot of our kids are not revising in the right places, their levels of concentration are not high, their levels of organization are poor because everything's chaotic, then environment design might be a good place to begin. Before we get to the activity itself, which is in the booklet, here are the slides that I use to introduce it. We look at the work of James Clear. You might be familiar with Clear. His book, Atomic Habits, seems to be like permanently at the top of the bestseller lists. He's very good at writing about habit, Clear, on his blog as well. In fact, if you look at his blog, you get basically his book cut down into short sections. So it's a really interesting read. Here's what he says, that we end up in poor study habits because of the cues, C-U-E-S, the cues in our environment tell us or give us confusing messages about how to behave. Here are some examples from his own website. He says, we sit down to try and revise, but there is a cue, top left, something, a noise in the canteen, the coffee machine's bubbling away in the background, the noise of food being plated up in preparation for lunchtime, whatever it happens to be. And that cue creates a craving. I don't want to work. I want to do this other thing. And that leads to a response. I tell you what I'll do. I'll just buy a hot chocolate and a Mars bar, and then I'll just take 10 minutes off, and then I'll start my revision. And then you get the reward. This is nice. I'm getting a sugar rush. Oh, this is exactly what I wanted. And before you know it, Clear argues, the next time you hear that cue, food being plated up, the coffee machine going off, the same craving is triggered, the same response, the same reward. And so we end up in these negative loops, which prevent us from doing organized, focused work. This section he calls the problem phase, and this, the kind of somatic, the body giving us a solution to that problem. Plenty more examples where that comes from, but what Clear argues in this clip, it's 2 minutes long, it's a really lovely clip and the kids enjoy it when I use it with them, is that if you can change the environment design, promoting focus and organization by changing the space in which you work. Let's have a little listen.
The first idea is you want to make the cues of your good habits obvious, available, visible, easy to see. The easier it is that they catch your attention, the more likely you'll fall into the habit. One of the places I like to suggest starting is with what I call environment design. So basically, the things that are on your desk at home, your kitchen counter, your office at work, they influence your behaviors. And if you can restructure your physical environment or your digital environment, then you're more likely to actually stick with the right habit. So as an example, a lot of people feel like they watch too much television. So walk into pretty much any living room. Where do all the couches and chairs face? They all face the TV. It's like, what is this room designed to get you to do? And now I'm not saying you have to restructure your entire house, but there are a range of choices you could make, right? You could take the chair and turn it away from the television and have it face a coffee table with a book on it. Or you could put the TV inside a wall unit or a cabinet, something behind doors, so you're less likely to see it. You could also increase the friction of the action in the environment. So you could like unplug the TV after each use and then only plug it back in if you can say the name of the show that you want to watch. So you're not on just like turn Netflix on and find something. So that's an example of curtailing a bad habit with environment design. You can do this not only for your physical habits, but also the digital ones. So I don't know if we'll be able to pick this up, but so this is the home screen on my phone. Right?
Okay,
it's got
all black.
it has no icons on it.
I love it.
So when I wanted to build a reading habit, I have my phone and text message, but then in these two slots, I put Pocket, which lets you save articles to read for later, and Audible for audiobooks.
Right.
And so the first thing that I would see when I would open my phone up is I would see two apps that prompted me to read. And so I tried to make reading the most obvious habit in my digital environment as well as in the physical one.
So there you go. Hopefully that's a useful one to share with students. They often kind of quite like his examples. Some of them are outraged, turn things away from the TV and face a book as if that's going to work. But you begin a discussion then of, I wonder whether we could design an environment that lasts between January and June, which promotes a totally different approach to revision. And so we give them this challenge. If we were redesigning a physical environment or rediscovering a physical environment we've not been to for ages, like the school library, what would it need to look like? What we would need in there? What would promote really effective, organized, systematic revision? And they also design a digital environment as well. So there's a little questionnaire for them to begin, and they do this audit of what are my physical environments like? Where do I revise? What do I need to do? And then they make a little commitment to tackle one this week and one next week. Or I'm going to start with my phone, sir, but next week I'm going to think about where I revise on the school campus or the college campus. So there's a really nice, simple activity that you might want to do early on in this process of teaching students how to revise effectively. Hopefully that's a useful one for you. And so here we go. We've got 40 minutes, 45 minutes left together. And I'd like to focus now on 4 activities that are entirely looking at, okay, so how are we specific about clearly saying what kind of revision activities help, okay? So we can take our time with these, and you've got handouts for all of them. Now, I've shown you this before, but I think just to orient ourselves and to think about the process of revision, let's revisit it. It's good stuff, this, I think, and it gets students thinking. If you've never used this image with students before, the idea that revision is going to be is not the same activity repeated over and over again, but instead it passes through stages. That some stages of revision are about collecting dots. I'm in the stage where I'm preparing. We often call it the preparation phase when we're working with schools. And preparation phase revision is different from performance phase revision. Preparation phase revision is collecting your notes together, rewriting them, highlighting key terms, rereading things, transferring things to flashcards, double checking things in textbooks, having a revision wall with all your material up there, making mind maps. All of this stuff is about preparing for the next stage. What we found with a lot of our students is they think that's the only stage, okay? So that they're stuck in this notion of comfortable preparation. when what we want them to be doing is finishing the preparation phase as early as possible so that they can move on to the performance phase. And the performance phase is the phase in which they take the information they've learned and they turn it into robust working knowledge. And you might want to say to students, how do we do it? How do we turn information into knowledge? What activities do we do on our own time? How do we organize a revision session which creates knowledge and not just information? And pretty soon they'll arrive at the idea that you build knowledge by applying information. They'll often say, well, I guess you use the knowledge to like answer an exam question. Great, that's what you're after. Capture that, because that's what we want to raise awareness of with students and with parents, that the preparation phase and the performance phase often look very different. Okay, so if you wanted to explore that a little bit further, I like doing this with students, asking them to list the activities that they do during the preparation phase when you're collecting dots, making things look neat and tidy, and then list the activities you use during the performance phase. And often it's something like this. They come out with lots of, well, I summarize my notes, I read them, I highlight them, I try and condense them, I put them on flashcards, I create mind maps out of them. But what we have over this side is I regularly test my recall. I explain complex ideas to someone else. I complete questions under time conditions. I organize questions into easy, medium, hard groups so that I can differentiate revision sessions. I mark the time work that I've just done to an exam mark scheme. And what we've found working with cohorts of students is that many of them don't do the work on the right-hand side. They do the work on the left-hand side. And that when parents encourage students to revise, their focus is on encouraging work on the left-hand side. And often when we audit, what advice is the school giving about revision? It's haphazard stuff about mostly sitting on the left-hand side and not as much on the phase, and the performance phase is a useful starting point. Now, I think there are three concepts or ideas that we all need to be fluently familiar with when we're talking about revision. So 3 theorists worth your time. Here we go. Anders Ericsson, Robert Bjork, Afton Kirk-Johnson. And their studies are fascinating. And we can cover them pretty quickly. Ericsson, we should know. This is Anders Ericsson, Florida State, who talks about the concept of deliberate practice. Okay, I've taken this from Jeff Colvin's book, Talent is Overrated, which is a bit of a classic, well worth exploring. Good read, where he focuses on the fact that champions are not born, they're made, you know, to steal a phrase from Matthew Said. And Colvin focuses specifically on what deliberate practice looks like. I think number 4 and number 5 are really, really important. Okay, that really effective revision is mentally demanding, okay, because it requires an effort of focus and concentration. And this is what makes it deliberate, as distinct from mindless repetition. And secondly, it's hard. And I love Colvin's quote here, doing things we know how to do well is enjoyable. And that's exactly the opposite of what deliberate practice demands. So I think a feature of the performance phase is deliberate practice, and a feature of the preparation phase is the more kind of reliable, predictable rewriting of notes. That's why students avoid the performance phase. It's harder. So I think that's an interesting idea to explore with them. Let's talk about Bjork at UCLA. His work is extensive, and I've chosen a very short quote to summarize it. We're going to pick out this idea of desirable difficulty, and I'm going to read this short section to you because it's really important. The most important message is that learners should break away from the misconception that the most effective ways of learning are those that make learning easy. The experience of having to expend effort, generate errors, and work hard to achieve understanding should not be interpreted as evidence of one's inadequacy. All right, Instead, these are important steps towards long-term learning and comprehension. Okay, so this idea of desirable difficulty, we should be designing revision sessions that are hard, all right, not immediately, but later, because that is, again, distinguishes the performance phase from the preparation phase, is really important. So I talk to students about desirable difficulty. Have we got enough difficulty here? That's what we're after. That's what we want. The exam's going to be difficult. Your revision sessions should mirror that. And then finally, and I'm super geeky about this last piece, Afton Kirk Johnson's work, senior researcher at Pittsburgh. This is going to go down as a seminal piece of research one day, I reckon. I absolutely love it. So I'm going to quote rather more extensively from Kirk Johnson's work. Here's what she's interested in. The way in which students misinterpret how well they're learning. Okay. And because they misinterpret how well they're learning when they revise, they make poor choices about how to revise in the future. It's all hyperlinked for you at the bottom in case you want to check it out. It's big. This is a big study. But I've got some quotations from it that I think are really useful to share with staff, potentially parents, possibly students. Let's dive in. Here's what Kirk Johnson says. Learners can't accurately assess which study techniques are helping them learn. All right. They have to kind of just guess. They do a revision session and they go, yeah, that kind of felt pretty good. I think I've learned it now. And they're doing this on various cues. How fluent did it feel? How good do I feel at the end? Did that work for me? As a result, they often see revision as something that's intensely personal. This is the way I revise, not revision works this way for everybody. She goes on to say, let's imagine a student preparing for a chemistry exam by doing two things at once, rereading the textbook and doing practice problems. Now, this student doesn't know which of the exercises yields the best performance on the exam. We do, all right, we've read the literature. We know that rereading the textbook will lead to poorer performance than doing the practice problems. All we need to do is read Dunlosky's work on that, and we know that. But the student doesn't know this. They're doing both actions at once. And so they have to guess, how did that session go? So many learners use what Kirk Johnson calls in the moment processing fluency to monitor how well their revision's going. All right. That felt fluent. It felt kind of straightforward. It's gone well. I'll do that again in future. Or that session wasn't fluent. I hit problems. It was hard. It made me think. I didn't get much done in the time. I'm not going to be using that in the future. As a result, this is what Kirk Johnson says, ease of processing is misleading in choosing future learning strategies. Okay, so the strategies that produce better long-term retention require more difficult processing in the short-term, desirable difficulty. But students feel it's uncomfortable. They don't like it, so they don't choose it. So there's the paradox that we face here. To summarize, Kirk Johnson's abstract is this. She gives students a pair of contrasting study strategies. Let's just look at studies 2 and 3, where they have to do retrieval practice or just rereading their notes. And then they make a decision afterwards, which one worked better. Now we know retrieval practice works better than rereading your notes, but the students don't feel that. Instead, when they perceive a strategy as more effortful, they rated it as less effective for learning, and they were less likely to choose it in the future. So we've really got to be careful here. And we've got to be super clear with students. If you've done a revision session that felt hard, where you weren't fluent, where you were coming up against challenges and problems, that's not a sign that it was a poorly designed session. It's a sign potentially that you are operating at the edge of your ability, which is where you need to be. Okay. So the following activities that we're going to cover now are all encouraging students to move towards the edge of their ability. What you're not going to hear from me tonight is, here's how to write effective flashcards. Here's how to highlight key terms. I'm going to be looking instead at the performance phase. Here's how to turn information into knowledge. We're going to assume that students have rewritten their notes, highlighted the key terms, made a few mind maps, and read the stuff. All right. How do we get them to the next stage? Okay, so 4 activities that you might find useful. We've got the revision questionnaire. We've got one that's only been in existence the last month or so, Cog P versus Cog A, which I'm going to share with you. We've got verbal recaps. Have we got the command verb table? I might have swapped that out and forgotten to change this slide. Apologies if that's the case. But we've got 4 to have a look at, so let's jump in. And we'll do the revision questionnaire first. This might be a good one to try around about this time of year to surface students' awareness and understanding of how revision is not the same thing repeated over and over again. Okay, you've got it in a handout, but I've kind of reproduced it for you here. It's 18 revision strategies. What the students don't know is that we've organized the revision strategies in a certain order to highlight a particular feature of effective revision. They don't know that because they're just going to say, answer this sometimes, never, sometimes, or always, and just tick the columns. Okay. So you say, you know, you're going to read these 18 activities. Tick always if you use it very regularly. Sometimes if you use it maybe once a month, now and again, and never if you would never consider using this strategy unless you were kind of forced to by your teacher. And on the second line down, by the way, it says Bloodle because at my school, that was the name of the virtual learning environment, the VLE. So in your handout, I've changed it to use resources on the school's VLE or something. So you won't have to worry about that one. So the kids do a kind of a thin slice. Let's quickly make a judgment about how I revise, and they tick it. And it's only once they're finished that you reveal, okay, step 1 of revising is collecting your dots, making sure that you've got the material ready, that it's neat, tidy, organized, recopied out, highlighted, color-coded, written onto flashcards and displayed in a nice way. How many always ticks have you got in step 1? So there might be a nice discussion at this point of, yeah, I do loads of this. Step 2, taking the information you've learned and operating under pressure, under timed conditions to try and solve a problem. All right. Step 3, assessing the success of the work you do under timed conditions and estimating what kind of grade you might get by marking it or asking for a teacher to mark it. And in your handout, I've labeled these step 1 content, step 2 skills, step 3 feedback. So if you wanted, the content skills feedback model is a good one to discuss revision. Okay. How much are students doing in each phase? Now, I would like you to have an estimate about what we found. This is what we did. We took the whole of our year 11s and we made them all take the questionnaire. Okay. We'd put it on SurveyMonkey and we had mixed up the revision strategies alphabetically so they weren't in this list. And we just asked students to do the always, sometimes, or never. So however many are in year 11, 300 kids, 320 kids did it. So we had a ton of data afterwards. And we could quickly see the proportion of their time spent in step 1, step 2, and step 3. Where were the always ticks? Okay. So I would like you to make a quick estimate now. Have a little guess. What would happen if you did it in your school? What proportion of all of their time were they spending doing step 1 materials, step 2 activities, step 3 activities? So you probably need 3 numbers that add up to 100, I guess, that describe how much time they spend in step 1, how much in step 2, and how much in step 3. All right. Why don't you make a little estimation now? 3 figures that add up to 100. That describe how your year 11s might spend their time. Now, if you want, you can stick them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and call them out, by all means do. Or you might just want to keep them in your heads, and then I will reveal what we found. Over to you for a moment or two. Okay, you ready? You can be watching this on the video and having a go as well, by all means. Here's what emerged, that our students were spending 80% of their time in step 1. There were lots and lots of always in step 1, loads of them. About 15% of their time in step 2, slightly under actually, and about 5% of their time in step 3. So despite the fact that we were trying to promote revision that encouraged students to operate at the edge of their ability, turning information into knowledge by solving problems under time conditions, what was actually happening was that students were spending all their time rereading their class notes. Now, for some students, we found that it wasn't 80, 15, 5. It was 100, 0, 0. We had a significant proportion of students who did no work at all in step 2 or step 3. Often in humanities, by the way. A lot of English students at A level had 100, 0, 0 as their revision strategies. Mathematicians and scientists tended to be different. They tended to do more step 2 work. They'd have been encouraged to do so during their classes. But broadly speaking, we saw this, therefore, as a way of persuading students out of step 1 towards step 2 and step 3. We would often interview students to find out what their revision strategies were like, and then wait until they got up their grades and then double check. You know, here's a kid who got 3 A stars at A level. How did they revise? So this is a bit of a classic example that I share quite often of a student who got 2 A stars and an A at our place at A level. And she demonstrates a kind of a revision profile which typifies really high performing students. We've seen it over and over again. First of all, they have a lot of ticks in the always column. So there's idea number 1 to pursue. A lot of our underperforming students just had a poverty of revision strategies. They had 2 ticks in the always column or 3. That's all they did. They did the same thing over and over again. These were often the kids who said revision was boring, or it was dreadful, or I can't do any more of this. It's doing my head in, sir. And part of the problem was there was such a richness in what high effort students were doing, they could go for longer. There's the first thing. Second thing to watch out for, ticks in the always column in all 3 zones. Always for content, always for skills, and always for feedback. This student does that, which I thought was really interesting as well. And it was worth pointing out also what they did never. And some of my students could not believe that this student had ticked never for reading through class notes. But often high-performing students just don't do that anymore. They've kind of done it all year. They're on top of that kind of stuff. They're much more interested in writing exam answers under time conditions, or, and Tulsi's put little exclamation marks next to her favourite ones, using past exam questions and planning answers. That's where she's operating. She's not rereading her class notes. So this has been a really interesting process for our students. You don't have to just do it once. You could do it once now. Highlight the fact that there's a lot of content revision happening here, and say, as we move through the spring, we need to see you doing more of the skills and feedback activities as well. Okay, so hopefully that's a useful one for you. Now, how are we doing for time? Not too badly. Here's activity number 2. This is called Cog P versus Cog A, which sounds ridiculous. So I apologize for its terrible title. Perhaps you'll find it more useful when you look at the work that it's based on. This is Catherine Stanger Hall at the University of Georgia. I think she's done a terrific piece of work here, looking at the process of revising for biology. It's a fascinating study. Here's what she did. She taught the whole of this undergraduate cohort, all right? So she was teaching them all. So she was using the same materials. She would design the same lessons. She was requiring the same work of them. But she told half the year group that once we get to the end of this topic, at the end of the semester, you're going to be tested by a 90-question multiple choice exam. Okay, so one half of the year group were told that right at the start. Multiple choice exam. And then the other half of the year group are told this: at the end of the semester, you're going to be tested by doing a 90-question multiple choice exam, followed by a series of short answer questions where I expect coherent prose, explaining in full sentences exactly how particular things work. So we had the multiple choice kids and the short answer question and multiple choice kids. And then her research team just studied how they revised, knowing that their exams looked that way. Here's what she discovered: that the students fell quite quickly into two groups: Cog P, cognitively passive, and Cog A, cognitively active. So if you want to share this with students, just remind them, okay, they're taught by the same instructor. The instruction, the assignments, it's identical. The students in the two sections, by the way, studied for about the same amount of time. Cog A did not do more hours than Cog P, or either way round. The kids studied about the same amount of time, and then they go into their final exams. Of course, they're both taking the multiple choice questions, which is clever. So what happens? Well, before we do the big reveal, a little bit more on what Cog P, cognitively passive, looked like and cognitively active looked like. Here were the cognitively passive activities: reading the textbook, rereading your class notes, turning them into flashcards and reading them, highlighting key terms during reading, and if ever there was a tricky definition, question, or issue, looking it up to find out what it meant. Okay, cognitively passive. That was the behavior of the students who knew they had a multiple choice exam at the end of the year. Cognitively active students knew they had short answer questions, so they were revising differently, repeatedly asking themselves, how does it work? Why does it work this way? And trying to explain it. Creating and answering challenging study questions, closing their notes and testing how much they could remember without looking, drawing and labeling diagrams from memory, setting tests and trying to answer the questions, but only when they couldn't do that would they look information up. Okay, so there you go. Cognitively passive, cognitively active. What did Stanger Hall find? Cognitively active students scored significantly higher on the multiple choice. They scored significantly higher on the tougher questions of the multiple choice. They learned significantly more, including critical thinking skills, and a lot of them agreed that they saw the value of the way in which they'd prepared, particularly compared to the passive students who felt that it had all been a bit, they hadn't found it anywhere near as positive an experience. So this is fascinating. Cognitively active students outperform cognitively passive students by revising for the same amount of time, but doing it differently. So we finish this activity by saying, okay, you're going to design a revision session for a subject of your choice using one of these 5 strategies. And you might get students to work in pairs or groups to do this, and then they go away and do that kind of revision. I've been big on this one recently because I've been saying you do not have to revise for more hours. You have to revise in a different way. So that's been a bit of a winner for encouraging students to be more cognitively active. All right, so that's Cog P versus Cog A. Hopefully that's been a useful one for you. We've got 2 more and then we're nearly done. So thanks for hanging on. Appreciate it. We've got an activity called Test Your Future Self. So let's very quickly have a look at this one. Quite straightforward, this. We know that practice tests improve student performance. Retrieval practice is absolutely central. But we also know that a lot of students say things like, well, where are all the tests? Are you going to make them for us, miss? And you think, gosh, this is going to take me a long time. How do I prepare a year's worth of tests for these guys? This is a very simple way of tackling it. It's called Test Your Future Self. And you can deliver it very simply and straightforwardly in your own classes if you want. So next time you finish a section of your course, a topic, you can say to your kids, well, that's it. We've done this little bit of the course and we're not returning to it again. for 2 or 3 weeks. So you'll quickly forget it. But we are going to dive back into it in just before February half term. I'm making the date so you can make it fit. We're going to dive back into this just before Feb half term. And I'd like you to set yourself a test for that week where we just review this information, and you give them lots of support. Remember, this is all in your handout. I often say to my lot, I'd like it to be a 10-question test. And I'd like you to start with this question of yourselves. If you recall this material perfectly, what would you know? And let's make a list of what outstanding would look like. You'd know this, you'd understand this, you'd know these key terms. And the kids need a little bit of time to do that, 15, 20 minutes working, calling out ideas, until we've pretty much summarized the entire topic. Okay, you say, let's design future you a test. Let's start with the easy questions, please. I want you to, when you're doing this test in 3 weeks' time, I want you to kind of dive in and feel you're all right on question 1, 2, and 3. Let's go for some simpler ones. So I often say, you know, I'm talking to point 3 here. Start with what's or when's. Get some definitions sorted or some basics sorted. Once you're question 4 or 5, you start moving towards the hows or the whys, the further explaining questions. And then I say to my lot, consider finishing with a tricky question which gets close to replicating what an exam question might look like. And they'd have a go at that. And then finally, make a note of the kind of score that you'd be happy with if you got it in 3 weeks' time. It does not have to be 10 out of 10, of course. Let's not be mean about to our future selves. Write a little note. They quite enjoy doing this. Hello, future me. I hope you don't find this too hard. It looks okay to me. If you got 7 out of 10 on this, I'd be really delighted. Hope everything's going well. And then you just take the tests in. And of course, you know, they've forgotten them by the following day, let alone 2 or 3 weeks time where you say, we're just going to review that section of the course again. And you're going to begin by taking your own test. Oh gosh, they're furious with themselves. With their past selves. Why did I make this so difficult? I can't believe I thought I would remember any of this. This is a disaster. What, I'm meant to get 7 out of 10? And they have a go. They try their very best. And then you say, right, let's review the topic. But what the students do then is that they're already focused on the bits they couldn't do. So their review of the topic is much more strategic. I couldn't do question 6. I couldn't do question 7. I couldn't do question 9. How come? Why have I forgotten? Oh, it's this, they're saying as they're going back over the topic. And what you model for them there, what you teach them there is you don't have to rely on your organization to provide you with tests. You set yourself tests. You'll have forgotten what you set yourself in a couple of weeks' time. And it will be like taking an exam from a really evil examiner. Great way of starting a revision session. And of course, that means that we all know about Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve, don't we? That we can space our practice out, that we can regularly revisit topics instead of cramming them right at the end. Okay, so hopefully that's a useful one as well. What have we done? The revision questionnaire. We've done cognitively passive versus cognitively active. And we've done test your future self. And we got one more, and then I can draw things together for you just as we reach the last 15 minutes or so of the session. Now, our final activity is called verbal recaps. Verbal recaps and explanations is my kind of longer title for this one. Now, I've had this activity written for quite a while, and I've been using it with students, but only over the last fortnight or so have I found an even better way of introducing it. So off we go. I'm going to introduce another fascinating study. This one straight from the University of Liverpool, just down the road from us all, compared to where have we been? Georgia, Washington State, University of California, and so on. So this one's a really interesting one from right down the road. And the kids have had fun doing this, so you can give them this as a little starter if you want. So here we go. We're with Dr. Becky Lawson. She's a cognitive psychologist at Liverpool, and she does a fascinating study about, she's interested in how well we can explain things we think we know. All right. So here we go. Lawson's interested in how we explain things we think we understand. So she takes a very simple example, and her example is the bicycle. All right, how do bikes work? Okay, and here's her argument. She says, well, look, almost 100% of people know how to ride a bike, 90% or so. About half of people own a bike. 100% of people see bikes regularly. So how do bikes work? That's her challenge. And she gets people to demonstrate their understanding of how bikes work by asking them to draw one. All right, the kids have a laugh with this. Straight from Lawson's paper, here's what she says. Please, first, she says, rate your knowledge of how bikes work on a scale of 1 to 7. 1 means I don't really know anything about bikes. 7 means, yeah, I know how bikes work. So you make a little judgment of yourself. And then she also, to help you, gives you that much to get started. Here's the outline of your bike. Now fill in the rest. And she gives it to people who think they know bikes really well, who might not know bikes that well. And she's interested in the extent to which the image shows a working knowledge of how this very simple thing operates. All right, so the kids can have a go at this. There's a lot of laughter in the room as they do it. And then you can show them some of the responses that the doctor got during the research. Let's have a look at these, for example. A lot of laughter as you show these. Here's 4 examples of people who claim to know bikes well, all of whom have the chain leading from the back wheel all the way to the front wheel, meaning steering the bike would be impossible. 2 of the 4 have the pedals attached to the front wheel, which doesn't happen post tricycles when you're 3. 1 of the 4 doesn't have the pedal attached to the chain. None of the 4 have the frame in any sort of way that would support a rider, with the exception of perhaps A, which has this strange cross bracing. Only 1 of them has put brakes on it. That's B. But B has the pedals in the right position, but has made the mistake of putting the chain across both wheels. It's fascinating. What Lawson argues is so many people have virtually no knowledge of how bikes function, despite the fact they see them all the time and they think they do. Here are some of the participants leaving the experiment and being asked for comments. Okay. One's making an excuse. Look, I know a bike when I see it, but it's different when you're asked to do it in a room, says stroppy person number 1. But others go, actually, I suddenly realized I just did not know this topic as well as I thought. I cannot believe I found it so difficult. I thought I knew more about the workings than I actually did. It's hard to picture a bike when you're under pressure. It is an exam of sorts, this. I didn't think long enough. I never knew how little I knew about things until I had to draw them. Or my favorite, I think I know less than I thought. Fascinating stuff. Now, my argument is this. I think we often discover how much we know about something when we try and explain it to other people. And that's where this particular revision strategy comes in, that we have this illusion of understanding. I get this, sir. I know that topic really well. Okay, explain it to me. Oh, with a drawing. Oh gosh, that's when things fall apart. And that inspired this particular introduction to a revision activity called verbal recaps. Okay, so if you want to do verbal recaps, a lovely little clip from Cal Newport to introduce it. Verbal recaps are effectively talking aloud, explaining or teaching a complex concept to somebody else to prove that you really understand it, just like you might try and draw a bike. It's a nice little clip to start with, the Cal Newport clip, so let's have a quick listen to him.
If you find yourself highlighting notes or reading over notes or textbook quietly, silently to yourself, you're doing something wrong. You are studying inefficiently. Now, if you study students who get really high grades, you find they approach the task of studying in a completely different way. They approach studying as if they are a professor themselves. When they want to learn material, the way they learn it is that they lecture it out loud using complete sentences as if talking to a classroom full of students. They see if they can explain the concept articulately and do so without peeking at their notes. Because if you can do this, if you can explain a concept out loud, teach it to someone, that means you really understand it. And that's actually the most effective way to cement information in your head. Now, it's hard. It's harder to actually explain, say, a math problem from scratch and go through the steps on a chalkboard. It's harder to do that than it is to just read over the example in the textbook. But if you do it once, then the information will be cemented. So this is the trade-off we often see. It requires more cognitive resources to study in this active recall sort of way. But it takes way less time, because if you can get through a topic once out loud, you will remember it.
I love that. I think that's just really clearly explained. It's hard to do it this way, but if you can explain it out loud, a complex concept, perhaps illustrating it in the way that was investigated in Lawson's work with bikes, you really understand it. And so what we do with this particular activity is you give students a short amount of time to revise, say, a side of notes or a textbook page, and then you ask them to close the book, think for a second, in pairs. How are we going to teach this to somebody else? Talk aloud, and they're often doing it between them in a little pair or a team. What have we just been reading? And we give them these starters to get themselves going. Right, the writer has just been explaining that, or this section of the course explores the important idea that, or right, this page outlines the importance of, or the writer's argument here is that, and they have to put it together in their own words without referring to the material. Now, sometimes they need to have a look at the material quite a bit to finally get their argument clear. Then they close the book, they cover the material up, and they have another go at lecturing it out loud. It works really, really well. Here's another kind of further question that you might ask yourself. Why is this section important? Why is this included in the course? Why is it so detailed or not? Why is the information in this order? Lots of interesting questions for them to kind of try and lecture out loud, with a little clip for you to use if you're at all interested. I won't play that for you now, but it's nice kind of introduction to the idea of teaching an imaginary class. And just to finish this last activity, I've got a script for you. So if you're interested in encouraging students to teach for short sections, I go for this. All right. You give them the script and you say, why don't you start by planning your notes using these? Okay. There you go. Very simple. This afternoon, I'm going to be talking you through this. This part of the course is crucial because the key definitions you'll need to be able to handle. Well, I'm going to pick 3 for you. You're going to need to know this. Big ideas you need to be confident about are this. The exam's going to ask you this. So let's get started, folks, by looking at this thing. Okay. Can you just double check your mics, folks? Make sure that your mic isn't on at the moment. That'd be really helpful. Okay. So hopefully that's really useful for you too. There are the 8 activities. You've got handouts for them. All of these can be taught explicitly to students, modeled so that they've got plenty of opportunity to kind of experiment with them. I wanted to finish very quickly by reminding you of how you might put them together. Some people are like, well, this will take a year to get through. Not necessarily. You could do it in a tutor group. You could say, well, look, I'm just going to have a little mini curriculum. I'm going to choose 4 of the 8 that Martin has shared. And we're going to do them on these dates. And then we're going to have students kind of experiment with them. You could try that. Sometimes schools or colleges go for slightly longer curricula, like this example here of a 6-month one running from October to March. And sometimes, of course, you can build this kind of stuff in across an entire year. This is a curriculum designed with a group of schools who wanted the whole of year 11 to focus on how to revise more effectively. So we had motivation, organization, and revision as our focus. And here are the activities we decided to do with the weeks assigned to them. So that might be useful for you as well. It's worth finishing up with this observation, that what we're not doing here is delivering lessons, okay? You are not sitting the kids down and saying, here is how to revise. I want you to do it this way. We're trying to give them an opportunity to gradually move away from comfortable, passive revision strategies. So instead of saying, right, you lot, you're all being too passive, I want you all doing this instead. We've got a kind of workshop approach. Let's experiment with this activity and see how it goes. This could be interesting. Let's try it. Giving students permission to then reject it again at the end. If they say, no, I'm going back to my flashcards. Okay, but I'm going to give you another one to play with in a couple of weeks' time. Maybe you'll like that a bit better. The idea that we're having workshops, experiments, explorations, discussions, reflections on the process of revision is better than going in thinking, I'm going to teach them this thing and they are all going to do it from now on. Because attitude change and habit change takes a bit longer than that. Okay, so don't be frustrated if it doesn't feel immediately as if you've made a huge kind of impact. In fact, that leads me on to a slide that I really wanted to show you before we finish. So my apologies for kind of jumping ahead slightly, but there's one here that I'd like to share with you. That when we deliver 6 or 8 of these activities, we sometimes think, I'm going to finish the session and every kid is going to high five me on the way out of the room because I've changed their lives. Okay, but that doesn't happen. That does not happen. Often they shuffle out in silence and you think, has that gone in? Is anyone thinking about that? But often what they do at the end of session 1 is that they're going away thinking, whoa, that was a bit of a head pecker. But there's a kind of growing awareness. Maybe it is about how you revise differently then. I'd never thought of that. I thought clever kids got good grades, not students who revised the right way got good grades. So you're surfacing the beginnings of some critical thinking. That might take a week or 2, that step. And then you might deliver another couple of sessions thinking, well, maybe there's going to be a total revolution now. And there isn't. The kids shuffle out in silence. You think this isn't going in. But often what they're beginning to do around about that kind of middle stage is they're thinking, okay, they're beginning to critically assess their own performance. Am I revising in the right way? Am I too passive? Maybe Miss has got a point. Maybe I do need to revise differently. There's no behavior change yet, but there's a kind of surfacing of thinking. And it's only till session 4 or session 5 that they think, I'm going to give this a go. And they're ready. So don't feel that I teach 2 sessions and the kids are on board and everything changes. It might be that you teach 6 sessions and by the end, they're beginning to kind of get it. And you might have to go back to some of those early sessions and say, now that you're a little bit more open to working in a different way, shall we look back at that first one that I shared with you? So that's well worth thinking about as an approach as well. Okay. So that's it today, folks. 8 activities that are very clearly focused on revising effectively. I've left you the usual reading list. If you've seen me speak recently, you'll have seen that slide before. And I wanted to remind you, though you probably don't need it, that I'm at info@vespa.academy. And the fact that that email address finishes .academy kind of implies that there are 100 of us all sitting in an office waiting for you. That's not the case. There's 2 guys in their spare rooms, all right, dipping into this inbox. There's just me and Tony and Steve now and again. So you'll get a quick answer. We're here for you if you've got any further questions, and we're on Twitter @Vespa Mindset. Now, I'm going to stop presenting now and remind you that I'll be sending this PowerPoint through to Sean. Okay, so hopefully that will be useful to you. All right, folks. Any questions, comments? I would love to hear them. We've just got a minute or 2 left. I need to be respectful of your time. If you've got a dash, I understand. It's been lovely. to have you. I hope it's been useful. If you want to stick around for questions or observations, I'd be happy to help out there as well. Sian, if you've got anything you need to remind people of before they go, I think now's the time to do that as well.
Yeah, thank you ever so much, Martin. As always, incredibly useful and practical activities for our learners. Superb, thank you. I've sent everybody the handout that you sent me earlier, so everybody should have a copy of that. If it hasn't arrived, just give me a shout and I'll resend it. But no, I think that's all from me. I think, Martin, you and I were going to have a chat about if there's any other session that colleagues would want before we finish at the end of the year. Can you let me know? Or if you've got other members of staff in school who you think would also benefit from maybe a beginner's session on the VESPA model again, because I know that, you know, there's been some movement in terms of key personnel in school. But again, if you drop me an email, we can have that a chat online. But I think that's all from me, and I'm just going to end the recording now. Yeah, thanks everyone.